Two cars were speeding along a country road towards each other. It was a beautiful day. They both had their windows down. One was driven by a man and the other by a woman, and they were approaching a blind curve. And as they got to the curve, they barely kind of slammed on their brakes when they saw each other and kind of barely squeezed by without incident. As they were passing, the woman yelled out at the man, "Pig!" And the man yelled back to the woman, "Cow!" And the man accelerated and kept heading on and crashed into a pig. We are quick to make assumptions, aren't we? The man was quick to assume he was calling her a bad name, and maybe you were too. Assumptions are a natural part of being human. They're like shortcuts for our brains. They help expedite decision-making and thinking. For instance, if there's an information gap in what we understand, we make assumptions to fill the gap. We also kind of know patterns from throughout our life, and if something looks familiar, we just assume that it's part of the pattern that we've understood for perhaps several years. We also make assumptions based on confirmation biases, and biases of all kinds, right? If we have a certain belief, then we make assumptions based on our belief, whether that belief is accurate or not. We make assumptions all the time, every single day. And sometimes our assumptions can lead to misunderstandings. And so today I want to challenge some assumptions that we have about this woman we meet in John chapter 4. We don't know her name. She's mostly been called the Samaritan woman or the woman at the well throughout history. And we think we know her, but do we really? Or have we made some assumptions about her along the way? So let's talk about this woman at the well. The first thing we find out about her is she's coming to draw water, as women did in that day, coming to draw water at the well. But something is unusual about the timing. You see, women of the day would go to the well in the morning time so that the family would have water for the rest of the day. And oftentimes it was a very social gathering for the women. They would all be there together. They would draw their water, then they would head back to their respective homes and tend to the business or the chores of the day. But this was midday. The scriptures tell us it was about noon. It was an unusual time for this woman to be there by herself. And so we know some things about her. Jesus and this woman at the well continue to have this conversation. And so we learn about her. And then preachers like me have made assumptions about her throughout the course of history about why she was there at the well alone. We think, and we've told people like you in pews for 2,000 years, that maybe she was an outcast. That because of her lifestyle and her history and maybe her choices, that the other women of the community had shunned her. And so she didn't go in the morning time when all the other women would be there. She went at midday when no other woman would be there. But I wonder if that's true. I mean, that's a lot to extrapolate, isn't it? That's a lot to kind of fill in the gaps with. And so I want to challenge assumption number one. This woman was an outcast. All right. Second thing I want us to consider is this fact that Jesus tells her about her own life. He says to go and call her husband. She says, "I don't have a husband." He says, "You're right. You've had 5 husbands. And the one you're with now isn't your husband." And she agrees with that assessment. And so preachers like me throughout the course of history have assumed that she just was a serial divorcee, right? She got into a marriage, didn't like the guy, found somebody with more money and divorced. 5 divorces. And that's some bad choices, perhaps, in men that she's made along the way. Or maybe she just gets bored, right? Who knows? But she's made her decision to have 5 divorces. But I want to challenge that idea for a moment. You see, women in her day aren't like women today. Women today are strong and mighty and powerful and can make our own decisions. That hasn't always been the case. Women in her day had very little agency, very little power to make decisions. Women of her day were property. Women of her day didn't have the power to make the decision to divorce. And oftentimes what would happen is men would want an heir. That was the reason they would get married in the first place. They would want a male heir, and if their wife couldn't produce a male heir, they would divorce her. We don't know about this woman. We don't know why she's had 5 divorces. Preachers throughout history have suggested that she was a little loose. I want to challenge that assumption. Assumption number 2, she was loose. The third assumption I want to challenge. He says, the man you are with now isn't your husband. Interesting. The phrase that we like to use in today's contemporary culture is they were living in sin. And so we extrapolate and we assume that she's living with a man, quote, in sin. She's living with someone who isn't her husband. I want to challenge that assumption. You see, back in the day, there was a law. You can read about it in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 25. I know all of you are going to go home and do that as soon as you get home. Maybe you're going to skip lunch. You're just going to get into Deuteronomy 25, and you can read about a law called levirate marriage. You see, what happened in levirate marriage is that a man would be required by law to marry his brother's wife if his brother died without a male heir. Are you with me? A man would be required to marry his sister-in-law if his brother died without a male heir. And that way, it protected the lineage of his brother. It's called levirate marriage. And so, is it possible that this woman was in a levirate marriage kind of situation? The one you are with now isn't your husband. I want to challenge assumption number 3, that this woman was living in sin. Now, those are 3 pretty big assumptions that we're making about this unknown woman at the well, isn't it? Number 1, that she was an outcast, that the other women shunned her. Number 2, that she was loose. Number 3, that she was, quote, living in sin. That's a lot to put on this woman. And so I want to invite you just for a moment to see if you can find yourself in her shoes. And this is the reputation that you've had for 2,000 years. And maybe it has some truth, and maybe it doesn't have any truth. And how would you want the people sitting at Chapel by the Sea on September the 8th in 2024 to talk about you if you're this woman? Maybe you'd want a little bit of grace instead of a whole lot of assumptions. All right, now come back to your own shoes. Look at your shoes. These are my Sunday go-to-meeting shoes. Look at your shoes. You're back in your own shoes. Have you ever been in a situation where people made assumptions about you that weren't true? Probably. We probably have all been in that situation. And in that situation, wouldn't you have preferred a little bit of grace instead of a whole lot of assumptions? When I meet people who don't know me, like an airplane or something like that, and they ask me what my profession is, I always kind of close my eyes and take a deep breath. And if I tell them the truth, and I tell them that I'm a pastor, suddenly I'll hear them say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I dropped a curse word at you." I'm like, "Oh, if you only knew my husband." You wouldn't have to apologize. But that's the assumption they make about me, that I'm so puritanical that I've never heard a curse word. What assumptions have people made about you? This story, this woman at the well, this story isn't about assumptions, though we make a lot of assumptions about her. The story really, when it boils down to it, this story is about grace. This story is about outlandish grace. You see, Jesus wasn't even supposed to be talking to her. First of all, he wasn't supposed to be talking to a woman in public who wasn't his own wife. Second of all, he wasn't supposed to talk to a Samaritan. Jews did not talk to Samaritans. It's in the scriptures. And yet he was there talking with this woman. And get this about this unnamed woman. She is the first person in recorded history to whom Jesus reveals his true nature as Messiah. The first one. It wasn't Peter, it wasn't James, it wasn't John, it wasn't Andrew, it wasn't his father Joseph, it wasn't his mother Mary, it was this woman, this Samaritan woman. And what does she do with this information? She goes crazy. She goes back to the town where apparently she was an outcast and tells the people there, and she's so much of an outcast that they follow her back out to the well to meet this man that she tells them about. He's told me everything I've ever done. You gotta come meet him. And so the Eastern churches in the Eastern tradition, as opposed to like our church, which is in the Western tradition, Roman Catholicism, as opposed to like Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. In the Eastern tradition, they get her a little better than we do. In fact, they've even sainted her. In the Eastern tradition, get this, she is Saint Photina. Photon, like photina, like light, the enlightened one. She is the enlightened one. She is, get this, the patron saint of women's ordination. Oh, I knew I liked this lady. She says to Jesus, she says, I know that one is coming who will tell us all of these things. And he says, I am he. And she tells the people, they all come out to the well to meet this Jesus. And I want to read to you again exactly what happens when they come out to meet Jesus. Listen. Many Samaritans from that city believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I've ever done. And so when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. And they said to the woman, it is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves. And we know that this is truly the Savior of the world. What if Jesus had obeyed the cultural norms? He saw the woman out of the corner of his eye, but he doesn't speak to her because he's not supposed to speak to a woman, and he's not supposed to speak to a Samaritan. What if? But he didn't. He bucked the culture. He bucked the tradition. And because of that, all kinds of people from that city in Samaria believed in him. I want you to think back to the guy driving that car, speeding along the country highway, crashing into a pig. What if he hadn't made an assumption about the woman? What if instead he thought about the options for what she was saying instead of calling him a pig, warning him about the pig? Maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have crashed. And so, my dear friends, let all of us be slow to assume and quick to extend grace. Why? Because Christ is quick to extend grace to us. Outlandish grace, grace that is greater than all our sin.